Hi Year 10, welcome to our fifth tutorial on the Vietnam War. Today's tutorial is going to be one of two parts because there's quite a lot of detail that we're going to want to look at, and the packs that you are going to receive, the next set of packs you're going to receive are going to cover this idea of the end of the war in America getting out. So I'm going to split this into two tutorials. We're going to talk a little bit about the process whereby America tried to get out, but also spend a little bit of time looking at sources and what we do when we get a source question either at home or when you're back in school with us. So before we start looking at specifically how Nixon and America tried to get out of Vietnam, I think it's worth kind of pausing at this point and having a look at how some people in America did still support the war. We've spent quite a little bit of time in the packs and in the tutorials looking at opposition to the war, looking at protests, but it is really worth looking at the other side of the argument. As historians, we always have to make sure that we balance out our arguments. There was support for the Vietnam War within America. It was a smaller group, it was in the minority, particularly as the war went on. But it would be amiss of us to ignore this alternative interpretation. Of course, we know in the exam you could get given different interpretations of the war, and you need to be aware that some of those interpretations may be pro-Vietnam. So there's a few different reasons why we have people supporting the war in Vietnam. The first is going all the way back to the beginning of what we looked at with Vietnam, domino theory and the fear of communism. This has been rumbling in American society for a lot of years. In the 50s in particular, we have what's called the Red Scare, when people in America were really, really afraid of the spread of communism following World War II. That was really, really kind of plugged by the government's propaganda, and people were wary of, the communists hiding around every corner. But in all seriousness, people really did fear communism in America. People still do. They're really quite unsure about the idea of socialism and communism. So you have people in America who really truly believe that line that we are in Vietnam to stop the spread of communism so that it doesn't affect us in America. And it really links into the idea of patriotism. The word in yellow on your screen just there. You might not have heard that word before. It's not something we commonly use. But the idea of being a patriot, very, very kind of strong idea, particularly in countries like America. The idea of being really, really proud of your country and who you are and willing to stand up and protect your country against any kind of enemy. And this idea of patriotism went hand in hand with this fear of communism. And so some people really did support the war, particularly in older generations, particularly in those older generations who had experienced World War II, had fought for their country, had been part of America fighting for the freedom of the world, and this war in Vietnam they saw as a continuation of that. The other aspects of support, you can have a look at the silent majority speech in 1969. Nixon, remember, was voted in on the back of getting America out, but he makes a televised speech in 1969 where he appeals for the support from the group that he termed the silent majority. Those people who quietly supported the war. They were not as loud as the anti-Vietnam War protesters. They were not in the media as such. But those people who at home, day to day, living their lives silently, quietly supporting the Vietnam War. And he wanted those people to be more outspoken in their views. And polls that were taken later on actually showed that 77% of America at that point, 1969, 1970, supported the war in Vietnam, which is vastly different to what you saw in the media and to what you saw with the protests of the students and the different groups that we've talked about previously. That brings us on to something called the Hard Hat Riots in 1970. And if you've got time and you've got the resources at home, really worth doing a little bit of research into the Hard Hat Riot of 1970. Really interesting. So we're in New York, and we have this is following America's invasion of Cambodia and the Kent State protests and shooting. This is following all that. And we have students in New York protesting against the Vietnam War and against what happened in Kent State. What happens is a very, very large group of protesters, people from the construction industries in New York, hence the hard hats. They've got their, the hard hat that they would wear during construction of buildings and skyscrapers and things like that. These group of people who are in support of the Vietnam War form a counter-protest against those student protests in New York. And it's known as a riot because it completely kicks off. About 70 people are injured. And this really is, seen in the media as a sign of that silent majority aren't necessarily so silent. There is a group of people who are supportive of Nixon, but also supportive of the war continuing in Vietnam for the reasons that we've already discussed here. So that's definitely worth a bit of research if you've got time to do that. The final little bit about support of the war, when we're coming into America getting out, is the idea of political support for the war. White House administrators, the people that were in charge, from Kennedy to Johnson, were heavily criticised for their involvement in the war. They were known as the Hawks. And the administrators under Nixon were known as the Doves, of course, dove being a symbol of peace. And so you've got people on both sides criticising the president and the administration for either being too heavy in Vietnam, too heavily involved, or for promoting peace too much. The politicians in the White House didn't want the war to continue. It was costing them a lot of money. And they were being heavily criticised for it at home and abroad. They weren't looking good in the public eye abroad, outside of America. But they also were very fearful of the idea of America being seen as defeated in Vietnam. If they simply left the war, what would that look like to the rest of the world? They would look like cowards. They would look like they've been defeated. So Congress support diminishes for the war as time goes on. But you've got this really, really kind of tricky situation that Nixon is in. The media, public scrutiny, foreign criticism, really, really driving him to remove America from this war. But how does he do that while maintaining America's position in the world as the greatest power, and them not looking like they've kind of run home with their tails between their legs? So at this point, as historians, it's really worth looking at kind of the timeline of events that we've seen so far, what we've studied, and why we've got to this point where America needs to get out. Right from 1954 with the defeat of the French in Dien Bien Phu, to Kennedy increasing American involvement with strategic hamlets, things like that. Gulf of Tonkin really kind of pushing America from an advisory position to fully fighting in this war. An increase of American troops, the use of the draft, Operation Rolling Thunder. Then you've got kind of events that really cause a critical eye to look at America and their involvement, the Tet Offensive, My Lai Massacre. If you've not done those tutorials, then you should have done so. And then 69, Nixon being brought in, Nixon doctrine, the idea that he is going to try and get American troops out, he's going to use Vietnamization, start peace talks with Vietnam, both North and South. Then you've got an increase again of the war, where America invaded Cambodia and Laos. You've got the Kent State shootings. And then you've got kind of these formal peace talks commencing, resulting in what's known as the Paris Peace Accords, which we'll talk about a little bit later. A really good thing to do with this particular timeline here, if you've got time, a really good piece of revision to do for the Vietnam War, is pause this video, keep this timeline on your screen, and instead of using a straight line timeline, literally from beginning to end, actually create what's known as a living graph, where you show how the war increases and decreases, either in terms of American involvement or support or criticism. And you could add images to this graph that help you remember what happens at each point, called dual coding. It's a really, really good way of revising. So if you can, again, pause the video at this point and use this timeline to create a living graph of how the Vietnam War changes over time and how we end up at the point where America needs to get out. So why does America need to get out at this point? So Nixon, as you can see there, he is, as we've said before, elected on the promise of getting America out. The Tet Offensive, 68, massive turning point on your graph. The point where this huge shock to American people, the government, the armies, that they're not winning this war, and it's unlikely that they are going to win this war. So what are they going to do in order to get America out while still looking like they've not been defeated? So Nixon doctrine, which I mentioned previously, essentially honours that America will still be there to support South Vietnam in some sense. No more troops would be sent, Nixon stated in the Nixon Doctrine. No more young men using the draft are going to be sent to Vietnam. Yay. But it also said that they would be there to support and ensure that the ARVN was able to still defeat communism, and that any ally would be supported using America's nuclear threat and nuclear deterrent, which is quite a strong statement to make. So the idea of Vietnamization was just that: remove American troops, but still support the South Vietnamese government, help them stay strong economically, because a strong country economically equals a strong country that can withstand communism, and also support the ARVN to deter those North Vietnamese troops and the VC troops fighting in South Vietnam. So they would provide equipment, they would still provide some monetary support, although the American Senate refuses to send any more money a couple of years later. And still the idea that South Vietnam would remain a separate country, would not become communist. So this is really the idea, and we'll talk about this a bit more in a second, the idea that Nixon approached America leaving with peace and honour. Not defeated, not running off home a loser, not letting South Vietnam fall to communism and hence making the entire war a waste of time, but removing their troops but still supporting South Vietnam to stay strong in the eyes of communism. That's when it takes a little bit of a turn then, and this is hence where a little bit of confusion lies with Nixon's policy in Vietnam, and we have the increase of the war in the 1970s. We have America then becoming involved in Cambodia and Laos in 1970 and 1971. So again, you can see why for a lot of Americans and for a lot of people that were protesting the war, the students, hence leading on to Kent State, this was very, very confusing. Why is Nixon on the one hand stating they're going to leave with peace and honour, they're going to use Vietnamization, they're not going to send any more troops, but then they're now expanding the war into two separate countries. So this removal of American troops, America getting out, is very complex. So this source perfectly illustrates that idea of peace with honour, how America wanted to leave Vietnam. We have a brilliant political cartoon here. We have got Nixon is the cartoon figure in the middle, and he is desperately trying to control these two horses. And as you know, horses can be quite wild, quite ferocious, very strong. He's really, really struggling to have both these ideas, this idea of peace with honour. How can he, on the one hand, not surrender, not let communism win, not let people think America failed, while on the other hand, still trying to get out of Vietnam and stop soldiers dying, and at what cost? So to help you with your source questions that you've been getting set in your packs, please make sure you have an attempt at those. Don't just make notes or create spider diagrams or answer a couple of questions. Make sure you are attempting the exam questions that are being set. That's to make sure that when you guys come back, you're still on top of your skills. So this should hopefully help you with that if you've had a little bit of a too much sleep since we've not been at school and you've forgotten what the idea of source utility is all about. So when you are asked what makes a source useful, you need to remember that all historical sources are useful in some way. There is no source which is 100% useful, no source which is 100% not useful. They are all useful to us in some way. They all teach us something about what we are studying. And that's where the idea of NOTCAT comes in. You need to use NOTCAT. Every time you get a source, NOTCAT the source first. That will give you your answer as to how useful it is. So remember, NOTCAT, N, nature. What type of source is it? Is it a photograph? Is it a speech? What does that tell you about it? O, origins. Who made it? Who is the author? Is it an American point of view? Is it from a hard hat? Is it from a South Vietnamese villager? That's going to change how useful it is. It's going to give you a different point of view. How does that affect it? Does it make it more useful or less useful? P, purpose. This is the bit that really, really tells us how useful it is. Why was this source made? Is it a speech Nixon's giving to try and convince the American public to support him? How does that affect how useful it is? Is he telling the truth? Is it a source that's been made by the VC, trying to convince those South Vietnamese peasants to join their fight against the Americans? So really, really look at why it was made. Is it to educate you? Is it factual? Is it propaganda? All right. Is it there to be informative, or is it there to kind of twist the truth and make you think what they think? So purpose is really important. Content. What does it say? What does it show? Okay, lots of you are very good at talking about content, but you need to make sure you use these other things as well, otherwise your marks in the exam are going to be super limited. A, is it accurate? Is it true? Does it match up your own knowledge? Or is it very much biased by somebody's point of view? Is it a true reflection of what happened in Vietnam? And finally, T, is it typical? Does it match up with other sources that you've seen at the time? That might be harder to do at this point because you've not seen a ton of sources. But NOPCA, you can definitely do, and you can definitely use to help you answer those source questions. So make sure you're doing that at home and make sure you're sending some of those in next week. Next week's tutorial will cover the final part of why America gets out. See ya!